Hi there. I'm Margaret Andersen, author of Race and Society, The Enduring American Dilemma. In this brief introduction, there's a few things I want to tell you. First, a very brief introduction about me. Second, what I've learned from my students over my many years of teaching and how that informs this book. And then a few of the features of the book that I think both instructors and students will like. So I'll start with me. I'm a white woman who's been teaching and writing about race for many years. I've had a long career at the University of Delaware with visiting appointments in other institutions. If you knew my whole life story, and sorry, no time for that here, you might understand how someone like me would become interested and engaged in teaching and writing about race. I'll say briefly that I grew up as a young person in very different racial environments, all of them segregated, but in very different ways. I was born in Oakland, California. I then moved as a young girl to a small town in Northwest Georgia that at the time still maintained formalized legal Jim Crow segregation. But that was also a time of the growing civil rights movement. As a teenager, I then moved to Boston, Massachusetts, an equally, though differently segregated place than where I had lived in the Deep South. Now I live in Maryland, having taught in Delaware for many years. That's our neighboring state. I was also a first-generation college student and never imagined that I would be someone who would write a book, much less several of them, 4 of which are focused on racial inequality. But enough about me. What have I learned from my many years of teaching that informs my writing? Well, first, how we teach about race and how we as sociologists think about race has changed over the years. We've moved away from a so-called minority group perspective, one that treats race and ethnicity like a smorgasbord of different ethnic and racial group experiences. Now the focus is on understanding race as a social construction. And as I tell my students, if there's one thing they learned from my courses, it is that race is a social construction. I make them repeat that phrase to me repeatedly. Of course, race is experienced as an identity, as a personal attribute. It influences our social interactions between people, and it certainly influences how we see each other. But the primary reality of race is that it is constructed by the social and historical treatment of people in society based on their presumed race. And I say presumed for reasons you'll have to read the book to understand. I've also learned in my teaching that students, regardless of their racial and ethnic identity, are often afraid to talk about race in classrooms. White students may enter thinking that they're afraid they'll make some offensive comment even without the intent to do so. Students of color are probably afraid that they will be hurt by something that someone says about race because they have been so frequently targeted by it. So this means that you have to be aware of such dynamics about race the minute you enter a classroom where racial inequality is the subject. It means that faculty have to establish from day one an atmosphere where people understand each other. That's not an easy task. And if I had time, I would give you some of the tricks I use to open up those discussions. You'll see that I fundamentally think that empathy, building understanding between different groups, regardless of their different experiences, is critical to our teaching about race. I can't say I've always been successful about this, but I like to hope that I have been. So what are some of the features in my book that I think can help you as faculty and that will interest you as students? I'll name just 4 of them. The first is a feature found in every chapter called Challenging Questions Open to Debate. These are issues that look at contemporary questions that are generally in the news and I understand that they're open to debate. Reasonable people can disagree in their opinion about these questions, but my hope is that students will then use sociological evidence to assess and debate their own judgments about such critical questions. Second is a feature called Living with Racism. As I've said, I think that developing empathy across groups is critical to learning and understanding race. So this feature involves some first-person accounts from people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds, reporting on some situation that involves racial inequality. I think it personalizes the sociological evidence that you can find in the book. Third is a feature called Learning Our Past, because I think we cannot understand the contemporary realities of racial inequality without knowing the history from which we come. And that's what this feature is intended to do. It certainly can't cover all of American racial history, but it does give some snippets of information to give people a sense of the historical context for today. And finally, one of my favorite features that you'll find is called Taking Action Against Racism, a feature that I added in the current edition, because I have found that when students learn more about race, they want to do something about it. They often enter my classroom already wanting to do something about it. And so this feature talks about some of the actions, some of them small, some of them larger, by individuals, groups, and organizations that might help you understand as a student or as an instructor what you might be able to do to change our racial future.